Bias and Prejudice by Jonathan Tucker. The problem of bias and prejudice is a universal human problem. It exists wherever the unregenerate human heart is given free course to display its unsavory characteristics. Hence, when we look to the judiciary in the United States, when we look to the social services systems in the United States, and when we look at organizations that work with these systems sympathetically and in conflict of interest to support these existing institutions, we discover that bias and prejudice are fully at play within the judicial system. And in the unique arrangement of the social services system in the United States dealing with child abuse concerns, child neglect concerns, the problem of bias and prejudice becomes compounded by the fact that the system itself is devised on an inquisitorial model rather than a constitutional model in which guilt may be adjudicated without proof of guilt. The plausible yet specious basis for the presumption of guilt of neglect or abuse is whitewashed by the gloss that the system is run on civil law, not criminal law, and therefore does not incriminate parents who are alleged, adjudged, adjudicated as abusive or neglectful. The punishment instead is the stealing of children, the kidnapping of children. Bias and prejudice within the Department of Health and Human Services is built into the inquisitorial motivation and modus operandi of the Department of Health and Human Services itself. Hence, in adjudicating concerns of abuse, the law of suspect, rather than the constitutional due process, is seen at play. And the consequences are that families all across the civilized world have been sabotaged, subverted, divided, destroyed by the very institution which claims to protect children. Bias and prejudice exists when a system is built on the presumption of guilt before the adjudication of guilt, and that the presumption of guilt is sufficient without the necessity of proving guilt. The presumption of guilt is inquisitorial in nature and not constitutional. Given that those who graduate from school intending to become social workers are taught to recognize the uncertainty of abuse as being the jeopardy for abuse, that the uncertainty, the lack of clarity as to whether there is abuse is the justification for the presumption of jeopardy to the children, the potential for abuse to the child, and the justification, therefore, for the kidnapping of children. demonstrates that bias and prejudice are part of the educational program of social workers to prepare them to follow the rules governing the Department of Health and Human Services, rules which presume guilt without having to prove it, and therefore divesting parents of children, kidnapping children from homes, in many cases where abuse does not exist.